As a pastor slash occupational therapist, I've had to attend what we would call my fair share of conferences or professional developments, whatever you want to call them. And I've had to present at them as well. And by and large, I'm a weird person. I know a lot of people, when they have to go to PD, what they collectively refer to as PD, they like groan and don't like to go. But I get a little choice in where I go. And as an extrovert, even if I don't know people there, I get to go to a conference. I'm like, hey, I get to meet new people. I know most of the people in this church, that's like terrifying. You're like, what? But anyway, by and large, I enjoy these conferences or professional developments. Like I said, I usually find somebody I can interact with throughout the day. And I do my best to try to pick things that interest me. It may have been a book that I'd read by one of the speakers, or I'd seen a YouTube clip of their presentation. But I've always said that life is too short for boring conferences. And for those of you in the education field, I know you don't have a choice a lot of times, and I pity you, some of the things you have to sit through. But nevertheless, I have to go to these things. And one of the most interesting, if you ever had to go to anything like this, if you've been to, like I said, professional development for your career, if you've ever been to a conference maybe for a church and they have a speaker come up, they always at the end, they kind of have these Q&A sessions. And I'm glad we don't have these every Sunday, because it would make me a nervous wreck if I had to close the sermon and then, does anybody have any questions about what's going on? If you've ever been here on Wednesday night, you know how that kind of goes sometimes, because we end up somewhere where we didn't start. But it's always a fun discussion with you guys. But at these other conferences, there's this time where the presenter has to take questions from the audience. And the person who is presenting is really put to the test about whether they really know what they're talking about the topic. And I know firsthand how nerve-wracking this can be for a presenter. As I have done both OT in-services, and I've done kind of church religious in-services as well at different conferences. The pastor one is probably more stressful than as an OT, because when I do an in-service related to an OT topic, I seldom think about whether or not what I'm about to say will somehow wreck their faith in the profession as a whole. But when you take questions from the audience as a pastor, there's always this possibility that there is someone in the audience who is seeking or questioning their faith. And there's always this little voice inside your head that is worried that what you say might somehow negatively affect someone else's faith. And when I'm in this kind of public question and answer situation, I find myself repeating this prayer over and over again. Dear God, don't let me screw this up. Which is really my everyday walking around prayer, if I'm perfectly honest, by the way. I'm not sure about the theological correctness of it, but it helps me even in a day-to-day basis when I interact with people who may be going through something as far as their faith journey is concerned, or their faith is very fragile. Now, sometimes, if you've ever been to these conferences, there are good questions that people ask that kind of help define the point. There are bunny trail questions that you're like, oh my goodness, it's lunchtime, please don't ask that question. And then there are those people that just seem to have an axe to grind against the speaker. Either they don't agree with the presentator's interpretation of the data or the Bible. Now, thankfully, I've not done that many, and it's never really happened to me personally, but I have been a witness to it at a couple of conferences that I went to. And it's funny, it happens way more at religious conferences or book signings or that kind of thing than necessarily in the professional world of occupational therapy. In fact, I've never actually been to an OT in-service where some heated debate broke out about which kind of pencil grips to use. I don't know. Never seen it happen. And I think it has to do with religion's misguided need to be right about everything all the time. We always have, our philosophy is we always have to know who the heretics are. Now, what's funny to me is whenever I see myself watching one of these slow-moving train wrecks unfold, it's usually the person in the audience questioning the presenter. And the presenter is labeled as a heretic. Now, what's funny is I actually like the heretics usually better than I like the people who are doing that, the question asking. In fact, every time I'm like, ooh, I need to read more from that person because obviously they're making these people uncomfortable. And one of the things that always amazes me about the presenters is the grace that they have. And maybe it has to do with their experience of it. But they always seem to exercise a really, almost a supernatural grace when they're kind of confronted by what I term religious nutters who are out to prove that they're right, how right they are. The speakers that I have witnessed are usually very kind and understanding. They let the person kind of speak fully, or rant, because sometimes it does turn into a rant. And then they usually pause and they deliver their answers very thoughtfully, and it's usually very brilliant. And I'm always amazed at their ability to think on their feet and say the right thing in that moment. Meanwhile, I'm sitting in the audience in absolute awe because my face I don't have a mask, and so I'm just easily annoyed at this joker who's sitting next to me asking this question. See, confrontation and questions are a risk you take when you try to live out your faith in the public square. There have been times in my life, not in a conference setting, but where maybe I've been interacting with people on a daily basis, and you get caught off guard by a question or a statement that they make, and you're almost like in awe that people still think or ask this question that way. And I try to stumble through an answer or something like that, but it's never really that good. But then you get like an hour later and you come up with a real zinger, and you're like, oh, I should have said that. See, I really wish life had a pause button sometimes so I could kind of like hit pause and then think about what I was going to say, because then you want to go back and go, remember that conversation we had, like, sometimes it takes days. Remember that conversation we had 3 days ago? What I really meant to say was this. But you can't go back because it doesn't really work that way. See, Jesus in his public ministry had this happen to him on a number of occasions, and we've kind of been covering that a lot lately, where Jesus is posed a question from people who are listening to him preach and teach, and they asked him all kinds of off-the-wall questions, but he always found a way to receive them with grace and then also make a point out of whatever it was they asked him. We're in Mark chapter 12, verses 18 through 27. Then the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. Teacher, they said, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first one married and died without leaving any children. The second one married the widow, but he also died, leaving no children. It was the same with the third, and in fact, none of the 7 left any children. Last of all, the woman died too. At the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 were married to her? Jesus replied, Are you not in error because you did not know the Scripture or the power of God? When the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. Now about the dead rising, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the account of the burning bush, how God said, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are badly mistaken! Exclamation point. So Jesus is wrapping up a little series of teachings, and you can kind of read the passages ahead of it. And they're really brilliant things, talking about paying taxes to Caesar and all these other kind of things. And it gets to the end, and it's the question and answer. I don't really know if it's the end. These could just be religious people that kind of butt into the middle of the presentation. They want to ask a question. They have this burning question. And this is a group called the Sadducees. Now, we don't hear as much from these guys as we do about, Jesus' other arch nemesis, the Pharisees. But for the sake of this message, I kind of want to give you kind of a synopsis of who they were in the kind of ancient world. Now, they are kind of the opposite of the Pharisees, as like, if you could think of, first century Judaism as kind of quasi-religion and politics all go together. You had the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They're kind of like holy, or I don't want to say holy, like religious Democrats and Republicans. And imagine if they could control churches. That's what you would have. I know you can laugh at that's hilarious. So, and they were in charge of religion during this time period. And if you think that today's politics are contentious, it has nothing on second century temple religio-political systems. They threw rocks at each other in their meetings. So that's the kind of animosity you have between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So we haven't started throwing rocks in Congress yet, I don't think. But anyway, That's the kind of animosity these people had against each other. Now, the Sadducees, they belonged to the priestly class. They were more what you would call upper class than the Pharisees. And their emphasis was on the temple. They were by and large the ones who were in charge of the temple and its sacrifices. And the Pharisees, they had more of an emphasis on the law of the prophets. And if you see how Jesus interacts with both sets, you kind of see that play out in his ministry. And one of the major differences is that the Sadducees only believed that the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, those were the only holy, inspired law words of God. Now, they read all the prophets that we also have in the Old Testament and the history and all that. They read it, but they didn't necessarily consider it the thing that you went by. You lived by Genesis through Deuteronomy. And so if you kind of read through Genesis through Deuteronomy, you're going to notice something about those books. There's no direct reference to an afterlife. This was the main theological difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not believe in an afterlife the way we think about it today, if they really even believed in one at all. Now, later in the Bible, in the book of Acts, Paul exploits this division to escape punishment when he's kind of brought before the Sanhedrin, and there's Sadducees on one side and Pharisees on the other, and they're about to let him have it. Then he kind of appeals to the Pharisees because he says he's on trial because he believes in an afterlife. So then the Pharisees say, let him go, and the Sadducees don't want to, and then they get into a big, I don't know if they actually, start throwing rocks at each other, but they get into a big shouting match, and then Paul walks out. So he exploits this difference. That's how much they hated each other. But what's interesting is whenever we come to Jesus, or go back to Jesus, there is one thing that unites them: their opposition to Jesus. So, in true religious fashion, when you face someone you disagree with, what do? You posit a ridiculous, implausible scenario that in no way has any relevance to real life. And that's what they do. And I can't figure out why the Sadducees do this. I mean, I think they must be that threatened by Jesus. But it's really weird that they kind of jump on this thing with the Pharisees as well. So they ask him this absolutely ridiculous, extreme example story about an obscure law found in the book of Deuteronomy. And I won't go into great detail about it today, but the main focus, so and this is even ancient for Jesus' time, so this is like 2,000 years before Jesus. So we're talking 4,000 years in our history. So early on, when the Israelites are coming up, and they're fixing to take possession of the land of Canaan, Moses gives them this law. And this law, a lot of it has to do with how the divisions of the land are supposed to be and how land is supposed to be passed on from family member to family member. Because it was very important. Their religion was tied to the land. Hence why there is still a lot of conflict today around the land of Israel. That is the land, the place that God had given them. So what you had to do was, it was tied to family inheritance. So it was essential that heirs be produced to keep the land in the family. That had been kind of allocated under this allotment scheme from the time of Moses and Joshua. Thus, if you had a brother who died before they had children, then you were honor bound to produce children by your brother's wife for your brother. I know it's totally messed up, but that's Old Testament. Here is the thing, though. By the time of Jesus, this particular rule didn't even matter, because tribal attachments to the land and those inheritance laws were moot points, since 400 years earlier they'd gotten conquered by Babylon, and 10 tribes completely disappeared, and right now they didn't even have possession of all the Holy Land. So it wasn't like that this allotment scheme mattered anymore. So to recap, this is an irrelevant question about an irrelevant topic. In other words, an absolute, religious church question that people would split over, right? Because, we love irrelevant topics and irrelevant questions. What I find interesting is that this story mirrors a similar question story posed by the Pharisees in chapter 10 about divorce, which I preached about a few weeks ago. As in the previous story, the phrasing is important here. A man marries a woman and he dies. And then each of his 6 brothers in succession marry this woman. And none of the brothers produce any offspring. Then they all die, and without any offspring, the family line is gone. So what's important then is at the resurrection, whose wife will she be? In other words, to whom will she belong? Whose property is she? Because that's the real concern here. Ancient Judaism may not have been obsessed over physical property in the afterlife like the ancient Egyptians, but they did have an image about what the afterlife would be like. And in their version of the afterlife, or at least what they imagined it would be like if they believed in it, families, particularly nuclear families, would still exist. And like most pre-modern cultures, the value was placed on being able to produce lots of offspring. So there's this image of heaven, of a large extended family being together in one place with a man, insert patriarch, at the head of the table. Now the thing is that even if a man, if he didn't produce any offspring, would at very least still have his wife. But if none of the men produced a single child, then to whom would she be married to at the resurrection? You know what's funny is they would never dare to ask this question in reverse, if you think about it. Where a man marries seven different women and see whose husband he was. See, that would be completely unthinkable. It's kind of pointless question. Reminds me of those end-time preachers you see on late-night Christian television. Don't ever watch Trinity Broadcasting Network after 10 o'clock at night. In fact, don't ever watch Trinity Broadcasting Network. Just don't do it. But if you do, actually it's kind of fascinating sometimes to watch it and kind of look at some of these preachers and what they say and how they present. But late at night, what they love to air these episodes, these people that love to really get into end times prophecy about what's going to happen in the future. And he's usually an old guy, and he's up here at a stage, and he has usually like this very long chart. And I don't know why they love these, because you can't read them if you're watching them from television. But it like goes all the way across the stage, and they spend the next hour dissecting passages from Daniel and Revelation and some of these other places, and they try to line them up with modern events so that we know. Now, I mean, they're not going to say, now we don't, because they always put that caveat, now we don't know the time or the day, but let me tell you what I see. They always do this. And what's funny is these guys have been running this racket for like 30 years. Some of them 40 years. Like one guy, he wrote the book, The Late Great Planet Earth, wrote it like back in the 70s, kind of started it all out. He's still preaching. And it was totally like, you're like, no, none of the stuff he talked about then ever came true. So, but he's still there. And it's like, it's completely irrelevant to your life, to what's going on now in my life. But we get so caught up in these religious questions because these are the things we can control. We can look at this, then we don't have to kind of examine ourselves. So it's much easier to kind of have the discussion about what, the end times that we're living in. The world's all going to hell in a handbasket, and, Jesus is going to come back soon. It's been happening for a long time. But we would rather have that than have to go, well, I have to really examine myself today because I interacted with a coworker and I smiled at them, but I really, really wanted to stab them in the face with a rusty fork. We don't want to answer that question. That's the question we should probably deal with more. I don't know, does that happen to you? Is it not? Okay. I want to make sure that I am not the only psychopath in the room. Just saying. You wonder sometimes as a pastor when you verbalize this stuff out loud, you're like, these people are going to think I'm nuts. But we don't want to deal with that. We would rather deal with these religious questions that have no bearing on our daily life. And so that's what they do, is they decide to posit this question. Now, what's funny is Jesus he's put on the spot. He delivers an incredible answer. It really is an incredible answer. The first part deals with this question that they ask. And he kind of turns it on its head, you notice? And he makes it really relevant to them. This question of property and family at the resurrection. Simply put, at the resurrection, marriage won't matter anymore. I like to repeat that for people who build this crazy fundamentalist idolatry around this patriarchal nuclear family. In the recreated world of God, marriage doesn't happen. Families aren't created. Sex isn't necessary. Humans become like angels. There is no yours, mine, and ours. Why? Because we all belong to each other and God. Creation is restored to the way that it was supposed to be. Now, this answer, though specific, speaks to a much larger truth. Heaven, the resurrection, kingdom of God isn't about personal reward or a heavenly mansion. It isn't about jewels and crowns or any other such nonsense. Rather, in this little snippet of an image that Jesus shares with us, he reveals that the future kingdom is a restored, remade creation where relationships are once again restored to their optimal condition. There is enough for everyone, and no one is the property of anyone else. Women belong to themselves. Now, of course, I imagine that the Sadducees at this point are really scratching their heads. Because even if they don't necessarily believe in a resurrection, they didn't anticipate this image. A man and a woman actually equal in the kingdom of heaven. There are no families with a man in charge. And I can imagine that Jesus is either blowing their minds or making them absolutely furious, like the guy who's sitting in a religious conference just stewing back there going, I don't believe a word he says. I don't believe it. I can't believe it. I'm going to get my chance to ask another question. That's what I picture. They're furious at this image of humans as this kind of not necessarily binary existence. It flies in the face of all that they built their world around. But Jesus isn't finished. Because he realizes for them, it's kind of, why are the Sadducees asking this question? They don't believe in the resurrection anyway. So he's not finished. He continues his argument to address the unstated reality that these guys don't even believe in an afterlife. And he does something very clever. It's very hard. You kind of have to go back and really think about it. He uses the story of the burning bush found in the book of Exodus, one of the books that they acknowledge as as part of their main belief system, part of the Torah. It's the image where Moses is confronted by God in the burning bush, and God says to Moses, take off your feet. This is holy ground, for I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that I am statement becomes kind of a theme throughout his interaction, and I encourage you to go back and read the story of the burning bush, because it's very, that constant theme of God as a present reality is very interesting to go back and kind of think of it that way. And so God uses present tense verbs in his exchange with Moses. I am the God of, not I was the God of. I am currently the God of Abraham. I am currently the God of Isaac. I am currently the God of Jacob. Even though they have died long ago in the past and they are gone, and yet they live. There is a bigger reality than this current one that we occupy. Of course, you might ask, what does this story have to do with us today? Fair question, as we said in 21st century America. After all, 2,000 years later, we're still kind of waiting for this resurrection life to happen. And most of us today, we accept the truth, I would hope, of a coming resurrection, of a world that gets restored, where all of the broken things get fixed. That's kind of the thing of Christianity. It's kind of the thing we cling to. Even on our worst days, it's the thing that I cling to the most. That when all else fails, the hope that I have is that all of this messed up, broken world gets fixed. But borrowing a page from Jesus' playbook, when he speaks of the kingdom of heaven in other places, he uses the verb is, not will be, not was. You see, this kingdom is both present and future. It isn't just going to pop into existence magically at some point in the distant future, completely separated from what we do here today. Rather, it's like a slow burning fire that has been consuming this kingdom of man unaware for the last 2,000 years. What we believe today matters. How we practice our faith today matters. But most importantly, how we treat each other today matters. We can't keep creating these idols around which we build the image of an ideal relationship or some future pie in the sky and the sweet by and by kingdom of heaven and what it's going to look like. We don't have time for such nonsense anymore. Rather, we seek to embody the future of the kingdom here and now. Dear Heavenly Father, I love you so much. And I thank you for this day and this chance to gather here once again as we do Sunday after Sunday. And God, my prayer is that as we continue to examine these interactions that Jesus had with the people around him, we would keep trying to find ways in which we ourselves can be challenged by these questions that are raised and by Jesus' answers. May we be a people who emphasize the humanity of all people, God, and that this kingdom is something that is coming, and it is something that is here now. And may we be a people who embody that spirit in a world, I think, that needs to see that, God. The more that I watch the news, which I know I shouldn't watch as much, it can breed a sense of hopelessness. But as we see that, God, may we cling to the hope that the end of the story isn't this. But it also isn't just something that's going to come in the future distantly that we have no effect on, God. May we be a people who embody that future kingdom here and now. Amen. Would you stand?